The snow was not a blanket. It was a shroud, pulled up over the throat of the world, and I was the last thing left twitching underneath it. 6 days since the wagon axle broke. I was 20 years old. I did not believe I would see 21. The cold had worked its way past my skin and into the marrow, a deep and permanent tenant that had evicted all warmth. My pack, which had once seemed so full of promise, a half sack of flour, dried apples, a small tin of coffee, was now just a canvas burden containing a pound of useless weight and the memory of food. My world had been reduced to the next step, and the one after that, each footfall a negotiation with the ice-crusted snow that threatened to swallow my leg to the hip. The trees, black skeletal fingers against a bruised sky, offered no comfort, only a ceaseless, sifting whisper as the wind combed through their bare limbs. Every ridge I crested revealed only another ridge, another valley choked with the same unforgiving white. It was a geography of despair. Then I saw it. Not a shape, at first, but a disruption. A darkness that was too solid, too square to be a shadow or a rockfall. It was a line drawn by a human hand in a landscape that had forgotten them. A cabin. It sat low and heavy, its roof burdened with a season's worth of snow, looking less like a shelter and more like a thing the mountain was in the process of consuming. Hope is a dangerous thing in a body that has already begun to shut down, a fool's fire that consumes the last of your fuel for a momentary flare. But I had no choice. I turned toward the unnatural squareness, my legs moving with a memory of purpose that my mind could no longer supply. It was a long, slow stumble. The structure grew, resolving itself into logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney leaning slightly as if weary of the sky. It was abandoned. It had to be. But it was there. That was enough. The last 100 yards were a betrayal, each step a plunge into a deeper drift that pulled and held like a grasping hand. My breath came out in white plumes, freezing instantly on the wool scarf tied over my mouth and nose, creating a cage of ice against my own face. When I finally reached the wall of the cabin, I leaned my entire weight against the rough-hewn logs, the splinters catching on my coat, holding me up. There was no sign of life. No smoke, no tracks save for the scuttling prints of some small, desperate animal. The single window opening was a black square, covered by a wooden shutter from the inside. The door was before me, a heavy-looking thing of split planks held together with iron straps. I put my mittened hand on it. The wood was so cold it felt slick, wet. There was no handle, only a leather latch string, frozen stiff and retracted through its hole. It was closed. Not abandoned, but closed. The distinction felt important. Abandonment is giving up. Closing is a promise to return. I used the butt of my knife to knock on the wood, a hollow, dead sound that the wind snatched away. I knocked again, harder, calling out a wordless croak that was all my throat could manage. Silence answered. The silence of deep cold and isolation. My shoulder against the planks. I pushed. Nothing. It was not barred, I sensed, but frozen shut, the wood swollen with moisture and then locked in place by the frost. I pushed again, a grunt of effort tearing at my raw lungs. The cabin did not yield. I was dying on the doorstep of my own salvation. It was an irony so bitter it failed to be anything but cruel. I slid down the door to sit in the snow, the last of my strength gone. The world began to shrink to a grey tunnel. But then my fingers, numb inside their leather shells, brushed against the bottom of the door. A gap. A fraction of an inch where the wood had warped. It was a flaw. It was a chance. I rolled onto my stomach, pressing my face into the stinging snow, and worked the tip of my knife into that gap. I twisted the blade. A crackle of ice, a groan of stressed wood. It was a small sound, but it was the first sound of change I had heard in days. I worked the knife back and forth, chipping away at the seal of ice that held the door to its frame, the metal of the blade groaning in the intense cold. My fingers were useless clubs, clumsy and disobedient, the fine motor skills required for the task a distant memory. I had to guide the knife with the gross weight of my wrist and arm, a crude and inefficient prying that cost me dearly in energy I did not have. A splinter of wood broke away. Then another. I was not opening the door so much as dismantling it. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the rhythmic scrape and pry, the sting of snow on my cheeks, and the low, constant moan of the wind that was trying to peel the heat from my body layer by layer. Finally, with a shriek of frozen wood, the bottom of the door gave way by an inch. It was enough. I scrambled back to my knees, put my shoulder into the lower half of the door, and pushed with the collected force of my entire life. The frame screamed. The door scraped inward, dragging a crescent of snow with it onto the dark floor inside. I fell through the opening, landing hard on a surface of packed earth and forgotten dust. The darkness inside was absolute, a thick and heavy blackness that was somehow colder than the grey twilight outside. It smelled of old smoke, of dry rot, of the deep, patient cold that inhabits places men have left behind. I pulled the door shut behind me, the scraping sound echoing in the small space. It did not close properly, but it blocked the worst of the wind, plunging me into a profound and disorienting silence. I was in. I was alive. For now. I fumbled in my pack, my frozen fingers struggling with the buckle, and found my flint and steel. My hand shook so badly that striking a spark was nearly impossible. The flint kept slipping from my numb grip, and the steel felt like a shard of ice against my knuckles. Each failed attempt was a small death, a flicker of hope extinguished in the cavernous dark. I tore a strip of linen from the edge of my bedroll, fraying the threads to catch a spark, my teeth chattering a violent, uncontrollable rhythm against each other. Finally, a tiny orange ember bloomed on the charred cloth. I cupped it in my hands, blowing on it with a gentle, measured breath I could barely control, my own warm air a shocking contrast to the frozen world. The ember grew, a fragile star in the immense black. I fed it the driest bits of tinder I had carried with me, shreds of birch bark, a twist of waxed twine. A tiny flame uncurled, weak and yellow, and in its flickering light, the cabin began to take shape. It was a single room, not much larger than a good-sized wagon bed. A stone hearth and chimney dominated one wall, its mouth a gaping black hole filled with old ashes. A crude table stood in the center, and a three-legged stool lay on its side nearby. And then I saw it. By the hearth, a small, meticulously stacked pile of split wood. It was dry. It was seasoned. It was waiting. It was not a leftover pile, not the scraps of a hasty departure. The pieces were uniform in length, the kindling laid carefully on top. This was a gift. A deliberate act of provision left by someone for the next person, whoever they might be. The sight of it broke something in me, a hot wave of feeling so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. It was not just wood, it was a message. It said, "You are not the first. You will not be the last." Survived this, I carefully transferred my tiny flame to the kindling. It caught, licking at the dry bark, and for the first time in a week, I felt the promise of warmth. The fire grew, and with it, the light. It pushed the shadows back, revealing the cabin's secrets. It was spare, but it was not empty. This place had not been abandoned. It had been left. As the fire took hold, a real and breathing creature of orange and red in the stone hearth, the light stretched into the corners of the room, painting the log walls in a warm, dancing glow. The space was small, but it was whole. The chinking between the logs was old and cracked in places, but mostly intact. A sleeping platform, raised a few inches off the earthen floor, was built into the far wall, piled with fragrant, dry pine boughs. On the central table, a tin cup sat upside down. Next to it, a single iron fork. These were not things dropped in a hurry. They were placed. My own inventory was bleak, the knife at my belt, the flint and steel, a nearly empty bedroll, and one last, hard biscuit of pemmican wrapped in cloth. Not enough to last through a real storm, but enough for a night. The fire was everything. It was the center of this new universe, and I huddled close to it, letting the heat sink into my frozen clothes, into my skin, chasing the deep cold from my bones. The melting snow on my coat dripped onto the floor, hissing where it touched the hearthstones. It was the sound of thawing. It was the sound of life returning. Once the shaking in my hand subsided, I explored. In the corner furthest from the hearth sat a wooden chest. Not a traveller's trunk, but a heavy tool chest, built of thick planks and bound with iron. I lifted the lid. The hinges moved silently, without a squeak of rust. Inside, the tools lay in fitted slots, each in its place. A handsaw, its teeth sharp and clean. A broad axe with a smooth, oiled handle. An adze, a draw knife, chisels of varying sizes, and a wooden mallet. They were not new, but they were cared for. A light film of protective grease coated the metal surfaces. No one leaves tools like this behind unless they mean to come back. Or unless they know they will not need them where they are going. This was a contradiction I could not solve. It was a place prepared for a long absence, yet full of a lingering presence. I closed the lid. It felt like I was intruding on a private, sacred space. This cabin was not just a shelter, it was a history. And I was now a part of it. Running my bare hand along the log wall near the hearth, I felt a section that was different from the rest. The logs were smoother, the fit more precise. It was a patch, a repair. The chinking here was a lighter color, newer, and sealed with a thin, dark line of pine pitch that was still faintly sticky to the touch. It was expert work, seamless and strong. The man who lived here knew his craft. He had not just built a shelter, he had tended it. This was a place of constant, quiet maintenance against the slow, grinding decay of the wilderness. This knowledge settled me. I was not in a ruin, but in a place that had been fought for. On a small shelf carved into the wall above the sleeping platform, I found more evidence of him. A small sack of salt, tightly bound. A leather pouch containing a handful of dried beans, hard as pebbles. And a small, carved wooden figure of a bird, its form worn smooth from handling. It was a simple, personal object, and it felt more intimate than the tools. I held it in my palm. It was a piece of his solitude. Under a loose stone in the hearth, a stone I noticed only because it was cleaner than the others, I found his greatest treasure. It was a small book, no bigger than my hand, its pages bound in a sheath of oiled deerskin. It was not a Bible or a book of letters. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with a tight, neat script, written in charcoal or ink made from soot. It was a record. Not of feelings, but of facts. September 10th. First hard frost. Moved the remaining wood inside October 3rd. Bear came to the west ridge. A big male. He is not hungry yet. November 1st. The north wind has a new tooth this year. Reaching the wall by the door, it was a logbook of survival. A conversation he was having with the mountain, the weather, and the cabin itself. And now, it was a conversation he was having with me. His voice, silent on the page, spoke directly across time. He was teaching me how to live here. The first night, I slept on the pine boughs, wrapped in my bedroll, closer to the fire than was probably safe. I did not sleep deeply, but drifted in a state of warm, exhausted awareness, the crackle of the fire a constant companion. The wind howled outside, a living thing clawing at the walls, but inside, the cabin was a fortress of quiet defiance. The logbook lay beside me. I had read for hours by firelight, the man spare, practical words a balm. He never wrote of loneliness, but he described the habits of a solitary chickadee with such precision that I understood he had spent weeks watching it. He wrote about the way the sun hit the far ridge in the morning, a signal for the day's true temperature. He was a man who had learned the language of this specific place. He had a name for the creek that I had not yet seen, but that he said never froze completely over, Stubborn Creek. His words created a map, not just of the terrain, but of how to exist within it. The chimney draws smoke, not heat, he wrote. The stone holds the memory of the fire long after it's out. Bank the coals deep. Let the hearth do its work. Following his instruction, I had buried the glowing heart of the fire under a thick blanket of ash before I slept. In the morning, a faint warmth still radiated from the stones, a reservoir of heat that made rekindling the flames a simple task. He had left me his knowledge, a legacy more valuable than any cache of food. I ate half of my pemmican, chewing it slowly, making it last. The world outside was a wall of white, the snow still falling, but the fear I had carried for so long was gone. It had been replaced by a sense of purpose. I had the cabin. I had the fire. And I had the book. I was no longer a victim of the wilderness. I was a student. The man who came before was my teacher. I had a responsibility to his memory, to the care he had put into this place. My survival was no longer just for me. It was for him, too. 2 days later, the storm arrived in earnest. It was not like the steady snowfall I had walked through, but a blizzard, a furious, horizontal assault of wind and ice. The world outside the cabin disappeared completely, erased by a swirling vortex of white. The wind shrieked, a high, thin sound like tearing metal, and the solid log walls of the cabin groaned under the pressure. Snow began to force its way through the smallest cracks in the chinking, fine, sugary powder that collected in little drifts on the floor. I spent hours plugging the gaps with moss and mud I scraped from the corners of the cabin, my fingers aching with cold despite the roaring fire. The carefully stacked woodpile, which had seemed so generous, now looked terrifyingly small. Each log I placed on the fire was a choice, a calculation of warmth now versus warmth later. The blizzard trapped me, turning my small sanctuary into a cage. The darkness was constant, the shuttered window admitting no light. My only measure of time was the fire's hunger and my own. The worst of it started on the second day of the storm. A drip. It began as a soft, irregular plink, a sound I almost dismissed as part of the storm's chorus. But it was inside. Water, melted by the heat of the chimney, had found a new path through the roof. It fell from a spot in the ceiling directly over the edge of the hearth, a single, fat drop landing with a hiss on the hot stone. Plink. Hiss. Plink. Hiss. The sound was a form of torture, a constant reminder of the cabin's vulnerability, of my own. The small puddle on the hearthstone grew, steaming and spreading, threatening to creep toward my fire, my only source of life. The man had written of fixing a leak over the bed, but this was a new one. A fresh wound in the cabin's hide. The storm was not just outside anymore. It was inside, with me. I had to stop it. The water was patient. It would not stop. I had to be patient, too. I sat for a long time watching the water, watching the rhythm of its fall. Panicking would do no good. Wasting energy on a useless repair from the inside was a fool's errand. The roof was burdened with feet of snow, the source of the leak was unreachable. I had to manage the problem, not solve it. I thought of the book. I thought of his calm, methodical entries. What would he do? He would observe. He would use what he had. He would not fight the water's nature, he would guide it. I remembered one of his entries, not about a leak, but about diverting a spring runoff that threatened to undermine the cabin's foundation. Cover it first, he had written. Water is patient. You have to be too. Give it a better path to follow to a better path. I looked around the small room, taking inventory again. The tools. The empty bean sack. And in the corner, a piece of stiff, cured deer hide, about 2 feet square, that he must have used for repairs. It was perfect. Using my knife, I cut a small hole in each corner of the hide. I found a length of cordage he had left hanging from a wooden peg, another small act of foresight, and cut it into 4 pieces. The ceiling was low enough that I could reach it by standing on the upturned stool. I drove 2 wooden pegs into the gaps between the ceiling logs, one on either side of the drip. It was slow, careful work. I tied 2 corners of the hide to the pegs, creating a small, sagging canopy directly beneath the leak. The next drip landed on the hide with a soft thud instead of a hiss. It worked. The water began to pool in the center of the sagging leather. I then tied the other 2 corners with longer pieces of cord, angling the entire contraption downward, creating a channel. I placed the empty clay pot, the one that had held the beans, on the floor directly beneath the low point of the hide. The collected water ran down the leather channel and dripped with a clean, steady rhythm into the pot. Plink. 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 It was the sound of control. The sound of a problem contained. I had not defeated the storm, but I had negotiated a truce. I had used his materials, his methods, and his way of thinking. In that moment, the cabin felt less like his and more like ours. The storm lasted 5 days. I existed in a timeless twilight, governed by the needs of the fire and the slow filling of the clay pot. I rationed the last of the pemmican and the handful of beans, boiling them with melted snow from the pot until they were soft. The hunger was a dull, constant ache, but the cold was kept at bay. I spent the hours reading the logbook, memorizing his words, his observations. He wrote about the stubbornness of stumps, the cunning of a weasel, the particular silence that follows a heavy snow. He was not just surviving, he was paying attention. His life was a study in detail. I began to see the cabin through his eyes. The way he had notched the logs for the sleeping platform, leaving the wood's natural curve intact. The careful chamfer on the edge of the table, designed to prevent splinters. The small, almost invisible pencil marks on the legs of the broken stool, a repair he had planned but never finished. I took up his tools. The drawn knife felt balanced in my hands. I found the stool's broken leg, and following his marks, I began to shape a piece of firewood to fit. The work was slow, clumsy at first, but my hands learned the feel of the wood, the way the blade had to be angled just so to get a clean curl. I was not just passing time. I was continuing his work. I was mending what was broken, just as he had. The cabin was not a static object, it was a process. A long, ongoing argument with the wilderness. He had been one voice in that argument, and now I was another. I was no longer just a visitor, a desperate refugee. I was the new caretaker. The silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but of quiet purpose. I was not alone. The man who came before was there in the smooth handle of the axe, in the neat script on the page, in the very walls around me. He had left me a home, but more than that, he had left me a way to be. A way to live. The responsibility settled on me, not as a burden, but as an anchor. On the morning of the 6th day, I woke to a profound and unnerving silence. The wind had stopped. The only sound was the soft whisper of the banked fire. I unlatched the shutter from the window opening and pushed it outward. The light that flooded the cabin was blinding, a pure, brilliant white that made me squint. The world had been remade. The snow was a vast, sculpted landscape of drifts and dunes, smoothing every sharp edge of the terrain into a soft, rolling sea. The sky was a deep, painful blue. The storm was over. My woodpile was reduced to a handful of logs and a pile of splinters. The last of the beans were gone. The truce was over, I had to re-engage with the world. I knew, from the book, what I had to do. When the deep snows come, you cannot walk through them, he had written. You must walk on them. On the wall beside the door, hanging from 2 wooden pegs, was a pair of snowshoes. They were beautifully made, the ashwood frames bent into a perfect teardrop shape, the webbing a tight lattice of deer sinew. I had seen them when I first arrived but had not understood their true value until now. They were the key to this new world. I strapped them to my worn boots, the leather bindings stiff with cold. I took the broadaxe from the chest. It felt heavy, but purposeful. Before I pushed open the door, I took one last look at the room. The fire glowed in the hearth. The clay pot was half full of clean water. The stool stood steady on its newly repaired leg. It was a place of order, a small pocket of human intention carved into the wild. I stepped outside. The cold was sharp, clean, but without the biting malice of the wind. I took a step onto the deep snow, and then another. The snowshoes held me up. I was walking on the surface of my prison. I looked back at the cabin, a small, dark shape in the overwhelming white, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney like a prayer. It was not a forgotten place. It was my place. I was 20 years old. I had decided not to die. He had left the tools to see it done.